All right, well, we have the pleasure of talking with you all just after lunch, so I hope everybody re-upped their coffee. But we're really excited. We're going to be zooming out much larger than what the morning sessions were talking about, so going micro to much more macro. We are here to talk specifically around the topic of coastal storm debris in the context of preparedness and recovery after major storms. So we've got three fantastic speakers lined up for this session from three different parts of the Mid-Atlantic region that are going to be giving some unique case studies from their sort of different perspectives and different sort of roles and responsibilities. Really talking again about marine debris response and recovery after natural disasters. So we have on stage Kathleen Bergen, Program Manager for Field Operations with the DNREC Division of Watershed Stewardship, Shoreline and Waterway Management Section. We have Bill Burkett, Senior Director of Maritime Incident Response Team and Business Continuity for the Port of Virginia, who's responsible for emergency management within the Virginia Port Authority. And we have John Gallagher, Director of Hydrographic Operations for Maryland's DNR, the division that places thousands of buoys and markers, delineating boating channels, hazards, and natural resource areas, and removes hazards to navigation, such as abandoned vessels and debris. And I'm Katie Morgan. I am the Mid-Atlantic Regional Coordinator for NOAA's Marine Debris Program, and I'm going to be facilitating this session. And I've got a few framing slides before I turn it over to our speakers, just to kind of give us the context of what we're actually talking about when we are discussing debris from a natural disaster perspective. So first and foremost, I do just want to make sure we all know that the Mid-Atlantic is not immune to large debris-generating storm events. For many folks, when they do think about big debris-generating storm events, they think about some of the bigger disasters that happen to our neighbors in the south. So, for example, here, I've got pictures from Hurricane Irma in 2017. These are from the Florida Keys. So we've got big vessels in mangroves, we've got fishing gear in sensitive habitats, and construction and demolition debris in canals in the Florida Keys. We also maybe think about Hurricane Michael 2018 that flattened communities and put tons of debris into the local waterways, or maybe even Hurricane Ian, which was a Category 4 at landfall last year, and you can see some of the massive debris that was in the sensitive habitats of those environments. But, like I said, the Mid-Atlantic is not immune to these events either. Many of us are probably quite familiar with Superstorm Sandy that came through just over a decade ago. I've got 4 images here on the screen of different locations throughout the Mid-Atlantic region and debris that were in different habitats. So vessels, construction debris, tires, these are all in either nature reserves or on National Park Service land. So thinking about sort of the implications of all of this debris on sensitive habitats is one of the things that is important to consider when we think about storm debris. And again, Sandy isn't the only hurricane to visit the Mid-Atlantic, though. In fact, many hurricanes make their way past us as extratropical events, though we've had our fair share of tropical storms and depressions as well. But other events, such as major flooding from non-tropical storms and even tornadoes, as one of our speakers might talk about today, impact the Mid-Atlantic region as well. And so, like I said, before I turn it over to our speakers, I do just want to give some context around the NOAA Marine Debris Program when it comes to emergency response and marine debris. So just a quick background on sort of what we're actually talking about when we think about debris response in a natural disaster case. So, marine debris response fits into the disaster timeline in a couple of different spaces. So what I've got on the screen is kind of different schematics of sort of the response phases of disasters. So we have preparedness, which is sort of prepping for and getting ready for storm events to come through. We have sort of the immediate recovery phase, which is happening in the short term, so the days and maybe short weeks immediately following a disaster. So think about some of that immediate response that's happening right after a flood or a hurricane or something like that. Then we also have some of the longer term recovery. So this can be years in the making, where a natural disaster or flooding event will come through, and it could take, as one of our speakers might talk about today, up to 10 or 11 years for some of the debris to be recovered after those events. So in sort of our conversation today, we're going to be hitting on all of these different phases and some of the ways that different groups and organizations are dealing with debris across these different phases. The Marine Debris Program is tasked with preparing for, responding to, and recovering from the impacts of significant acute marine debris incidents through coordination and scientific support. So we're not talking about here sort of the pervasive sort of plastics issues and sort of the everyday litter and things like that. We're really talking about sort of acute events that generate large amounts of debris. Our sort of role in the debris response space really started about a decade ago in sort of its current iteration. And it was started by two major events that occurred: the 2011 Japan tsunami and then 2012 Superstorm Sandy. Prior to those events, we were doing a lot of scientific support and trying to sort of immediately aid agencies and organizations on the ground with trying to understand what debris was where in the immediate aftermath of events such as big hurricanes and things like that. But we were a pretty young program at that time, and so the Japan tsunami and Superstorm Sandy really catapulted our program into really needing to think through how can we support local, state, and federal agencies and other responders on the ground in dealing with massive amounts of debris and potentially contaminated debris, such as in the example of the Japan tsunami. Currently, the sort of three key objectives for the NOAA Marine Debris Program when it comes to emergency response is, first, developing guidance documents that can facilitate action. So I think several of them have been pulled off my table at this point, which is great, but we develop guidance documents which are essentially marine debris emergency response guides for all coastal states across the United States. We have one for each state here in the Mid-Atlantic region, which provides information on who's responsible for debris in what locations. It gets very complicated based on land ownership and sort of waterway sort of management. So we create sort of decision-making flowcharts to aid in the on-the-ground immediate response to and long-term recovery from debris. We've got jurisdictional maps, we've got permitting information, and really provide and stay up to date with as many local, state, and federal contacts as we can to keep all of this information as fresh as possible so that if and when a disaster strikes, we can hand this over immediately to those responders and they can get to action much quicker than having to figure out like who's responsible for this tire on this location or who's going to deal with this vessel on this location. They can just reference these documents and take immediate action. We also conduct marine debris response exercises and drills, so we work with responders to basically game out what would you do if an event came through and we needed to respond to debris in massive quantities in all sorts of different locations across your area of responsibility. So again, this is preparedness for and getting the sort of responding agencies ready to deal with massive debris generation events prior to the event actually happening. So again, we can respond and remove that debris much quicker on the back end. And then we also work to support the integration of this information into other sort of documents and plans so that, for example, the U.S. Coast Guard, as they might be sort of planning or preparing for their own sort of incident responses, can also have the marine debris related information incorporated into their broader emergency response functions within sort of the broader disaster response work that they do. So that's enough of me. I'm going to turn it over to our panel now. I'm pretty sure we're going to start with John. Yes, so we're going to start with John, and we'll go through all of our speakers, and we will hold questions to the end.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie. You guys got my introduction. I want to talk about post-2018 debris happenings because 2018 was, I believe, in a number of cities, the wettest year ever. It was like 71 inches of rain in Baltimore in 2018. If you all remember the Ellicott City floods, the second time Ellicott City, Maryland flooded, that was 2018. Really, Katie went over what we do. Essentially, we're a buoy tending operation in the state of Maryland. We also remove abandoned vessels. We mark all the natural resource areas like oyster sanctuaries and crab lines and all the different myriad of natural resource laws. We spent a lot of time, seems like recently, removing abandoned vessels, and then kind of piece by piece we'll get logs and things that we take care of for boating channels. I'll go through all this. We also provide ice breaking services. Maryland has like Smith Island, which is a bay island that these people are locked off if it does ice. And interesting enough, the last time we did have ice was 2018. and before that was 2015. But we assist the Coast Guard with that too. That's our boat that's in Crisfield that's responsible for Smith Island, and we go down to help the state of Virginia with Tangier. This is a picture of the Conowingo Dam, which goes across the Susquehanna River, and I believe the Susquehanna River goes all the way up to New York. So debris will build up behind that on a normal basis, and I believe the power company will remove debris as they can. But if it gets too much, they have to open up floodgates, and that's really what happened the summer. That was about July. Yep, July 26, 20 of the 53 floodgates were open, and it just inundated. The other part to this, so imagine there's a big debris flush, and it can anything, mostly wood. It goes into the Chesapeake Bay, but then there's a prevailing wind at the time. The eastern shore is less populated than the western shore. So if you have northeast wind pushing all the debris and tide to Annapolis, it's much more critical than it hit Taylor's Island or somewhere on the eastern shore. And that's kind of what happened to us. And this is just talking about the, about how we got to the point with the rain, and that's the flood, how it the water raised, historic levels on the river. And then, you can see this is like by the Marine Museum in Annapolis, and just a pack of sticks and debris. This is a shot an officer named Kevin Kelly took, and it looks like an island, but that's just a tree out in the bay. That was the kind of things that happen. So imagine if you're a boater just cruising along, and that's what you see. So this was a tree we were able to drag up a boat ramp and cut up into pieces, and this is just a debris field. So, and that's what typical would a beach. Now, I'm gonna get down to this. All right, so we have a boat that's like a landing craft with a small crane that we can remove debris. The communications were, in the aftermath of this, the NRP, Natural Resource Police in Maryland, has a line, it's kind of like your 911 line. They got overwhelmed with calls, and then of course the department has a communications department, and then the governor's office gets, and everybody wants help. And then we're sitting there and like, well, who does that? And it's like, well, it's Hydro is the only people that really do debris, and we were pretty quickly, overrun on what we could and could not do to help. And we had to just really make the decision to stick to things that were the most detrimental to public safety, and that's just what we did. We just started, and this was a months and months long process. The most critical that were causing people the biggest, like in an entrance to a marina or something that was the most egregious at the point we went with. We were removing about 5,000 pounds a day of debris. And I'm not sure of this number. This is really just a guesstimate. It's like well over 200,000 pounds of debris were removed. It's really hard to explain the extent. And then also where it went were some of the, again, you're all familiar, like Lake Ramsey or these areas in Maryland that these people have it's a really beautiful place to live, but it's a little tight area that if you have debris in there, you can't get out. Some places like this is Sandy Point. The beach was inundated. The Park Service had to take their own, and I guess I just say that the main thing that we could really do is where we could help, because we do give small grants to municipalities for abandoned boat and debris removal. We help some with that, but most of it, people had to kind of just take care of their own, and we did what we did best. There's just a bunch of different ways things ended up going on. on a normal basis, we work a lot with the Corps of Engineers. They have a debris unit in Baltimore. They have a debris unit in DC, but they're also they're tied to their projects. And, we have to understand that, but they'll help us out whenever they can. And the same way with the Coast Guard, when it's overwhelming, it doesn't matter as much, and I don't say that lightly, but I mean, if you have one tree out there and you have a report of it, and you don't pass it on that's a problem, so like if I get a report of there's a tree out in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay by the Bay Bridge, I'll call the Coast Guard and they'll do a broadcast. And so that, I won't say that just covers you, but it also, it's the best that can be done. And so we worked a lot with them to try to just mitigate what we could. And as time went on, where there were debris mats, they would report things and go. And, for the most part, I would say the biggest lesson that I learned was just be patient and understand that you're going to get beat up a bit, and it is what it is, and you just have to, do the best you can, and also keep good records. That's something I think at the time when you're in the middle of things, you don't really think about, wow, what are we actually doing? What are the dumpster loads going out? And it's harder to come back later. And this wasn't a kind of event that we were necessarily being paid back for. So this, and at times we had, back in 2012, anyone remembers the Derecho storm? We got FEMA money for that, and this really wasn't that. And just ourselves, we've tried to provide enough equipment that, because a lot of it's for abandoned boats, but we also just to have, we have an excavator, we have a skid steer, we have couple dump trucks. I mean, it's not world shaking, but it is enough. We have chainsaws. Matter of fact, I have guys in chainsaw class today to try to be prepared, because you can't, when you need it, you won't be able to get it, and you have to have it beforehand. We did create a flyer at the time to attach to different communications to tell people basically how they could report, because it just kept going on and on and on. It was months, and that was just that a lot of the communities that got together, because as Katie mentioned, it's difficult. I've tried to help out communities, and you speak to one person, and they're not really the person in charge. They're just the most ambitious. And you realize you don't necessarily have a right to enter their property, and we don't try to do beach. We're not interested in cleaning up beaches. It's not what we really have time to do, or we're overwhelmed from that. We're really more trying to protect boaters, and but I did have a lot of admiration for the people that took it upon themselves to try to clean up their things themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And next we've got Kathleen.
Good afternoon for you guys. Just to kind of give you a little bit of a broad heads up, my name is Kathleen. I'm going to be presenting a case study on the Indian River Inlet here up in Delaware. Just a hop, skip, and a jump from here. We do work in this area. It's a pretty unique location that's managed and maintained between both the federal partners as well as state partners. And part of that is the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, to which I belong to. So one of the things that my program is involved in is shoreline and waterway management section. So I'm actually the program manager for our field operations section. We manage and maintain 62 miles of publicly accessible shoreline and 120 miles of navigable waterways. We do very similar work to John, and very similar work to I would assume Bill. But at the same time, we are also the main primary managers for the shoreline in the state of Delaware. So it requires the program to be split between our engineering and sciences section and our field operations section. They're the brains, we're the bronze. And that's kind of how that works. We work with a lot of individual landowners, other state partners, state agencies, federal agencies, the Coast Guard, different municipalities, townships, as well as individual homeowners. It's a really broad program that we work with. And it means that when we have a coastal storm, it takes all hands on deck. Looking at our coastal storm debris response groups, there are some primary responders within the state of Delaware. DELDOT is one of our primary responders. They are there to maintain and reopen transportation routes and evacuation routes. That is their primary goal. Shoreline and Waterway Management, my section, we're really concerned about the resources and protecting our floodplain mitigation standpoints. We really are focused more on the beach dunes, our marshes, and any of the debris in the navigational channels. Our state parks, they really help us manage the public access to these locations. People are always fascinated by the amount of debris that it comes up and washes up on shore. You will often see people who are coin collectors, going out in the immediate aftermath of the storm. Their job is really to make sure that they are safe in doing so. And our DEMA is our emergency management program. They're really there to help the municipalities and local communities in preparing, supporting, and recovering from these storms. These are not the only primary responders, but these are the primary ones that my program happens to interact with during the actual storm events. So one of the things that I'm going to be talking about is Hurricane Sandy. So as many of us are aware, Hurricane Sandy came in October of 2012 to the mid-Atlantic. Heavy winds and substantial rain occurred throughout the area and created heavy tidal forces that impacted our coastline. Many of us are familiar, so we'll kind of gloss over all of the wind shear and all of that. So the case study that I'm going to talk about is at the Indian River Inlet. During this time, the Indian River Inlet was actually going through a reconstruction event. So in this location, just for some history, there has been 4 bridges that were built in this location. The first 2 collapsed because of corrosive forces and erosion along the footers. The third one was being dismantled at the same time that the new bridge had gone up. In spring of 2012, the new bridge had opened for north and southbound traffic, and they were working on dismantling the old bridge. Part of that comes into play at this time. So the old bridge hadn't been completely dismantled at this point in time. The contractor had staged large amounts of debris immediately underneath the new bridge for removal at a later date. Well, Hurricane Sandy came and had some other opinions. So this is a picture of the storm during the initial part of the storm. My program happens to go out prior, mid, and post-storm for coastal assessments, and that's only if and when the weather allows it. There are some storms where we just go out and kind of check on how the progression of the storm is doing, and we do that across our entire coastline. So this is just showing you how severe some of the wind at the beginning of the storm. This is a mid-storm progression. So one of the things I want you to take a look of, I don't know if I have a cursor, I do have a cursor, is right here is the old bridge. You can see this roadway and you can see the amount of dune that was in front of it. That's going to be really important. So right behind it, underneath this great big monstrosity of a new bridge, is where the contractor was staging a whole bunch of marine material, mostly metal, underneath the bridge. This is immediately following the storm. From the staging angle, just a little bit closer up. As you can see, we've lost several tons worth of sand just in that immediate area. You can see where the old bridge was. What ended up happening was this area happened to overtop, and it was flooded for a substantial amount of time. This is a good example of the immediate aftermath. And one of the things that we found was that the staged equipment that my program uses to manage and maintain the shoreline was cut off as far as access was concerned to anybody trying to get to it. Part of it was cut off because of a flood event. The other issue is that in all of this sand was marine debris or other types of debris that could pop tires, that was creating an issue of people being able to respond to it, and many other details that we have since learned how to correct. This is just another version of that, looking from the bridge, the old bridge, into the shoreline there at north side at the inlet. What you see is basically the old Route 1 that was making its way into the Route 1 corridor. A lot of this material ended up getting washed out to sea either during the storm or in the storms following, during all of our mitigation efforts. So this is a picture of what this area happened to look like in July of 2012. Just to kind of give you a frame of reference, you've got a heavily vegetated dune. It is in a good standing capabilities, and this is what it looked like immediately following that Hurricane Sandy. And then in November of 2012, you can see our sand bypass pipeline right there, and what we're basically doing is pumping from the south side through a sand bypass system and bringing any of the sand that had accumulated on that south side of the jetty to the north side of the jetty. So we did learn a lot of really hard lessons. One of the biggest things that we took away from that was a multi-agency communication. Our radios weren't dedicated to a specific channel at the time, so we couldn't talk between DelDOT, DEMA, FEMA, or any of the National Guard that happened to arrive on site. And so that was really a frustrating thing for all of our staff involved. Which takes us to about 11 years later, and I'm going to speed up as quick as I can. I see I'm running out of time. Basically, 11 years later, we had some communication with some of the local surfers, and they were detailing that they were picking up pieces of asphalt and concrete and were getting hurt in the north side inlet beach area. We went out and surveyed in July of 2023, and we happened to find that they were right. There were various pieces and effort of material that ended up, getting swept out to sea, and through communications with our partners over at DelDOT, we could kind of guess that it all came from Hurricane Sandy. Most of it was pretty considerable. So from the month of July to September, we ended up removing about 82,000 pounds just through volunteer effort. And you can see that it was a considerable amount that they were finding. And our community partners have been great. Surf riders were really right there to rally with us with Parks Department, providing assistance. My program provided skid steers as well as other equipment management support, and all in total, that program we consider to be a huge success. One of the things that we did find, though, was that there was still roadway about 80 feet out from shore from the mean low water. Which leads us to the end of September. The Indian River Inlet happened to have some impacts from Hurricane Ophelia. Hurricane Ophelia was much nicer than Hurricane Sandy. She brought all the debris that Sandy took out back to shore. This is just some better pictures of that debris. And basically, we worked together with our partners over at DelDOT, reluctantly, that they provided us dumpsters. We provided the manpower and support. And during about a 3-week process, we ended up removing close to 156,000 pounds worth of material in a very short period of time. Most of this material had to be removed using equipment because, as you can see, it is quite large. And it's really not safe for people to be walking in and trying to assist us as we did previously, just because of the fact that the material was much larger in a much greater scale. The picture on the right that you can see, all these little black dots, that's all asphalt that's degraded. And you have to really kind of take a broad scope picture of it. This is all material that we're not going to be able to remove from the system. This is going to take months and years and decades of volunteer help to remove every little nickel, dime, and penny worth of petroleum product out of this area. We did happen to do some sediment samplings just to see whether or not there was any contaminants in the area. Thankfully, there was none. That has us very concerned. Again, the challenges that we had were the fact that immediately after the storm, all the coin collectors come out with their little magnet detectors, and we're definitely very interactive with the crew members that are trying to use heavy equipment. We had to ask Parks Department to shut down the shoreline for a short period of time, which led to a lot of phone calls up to the governor's office, and they asked us politely to reopen the beach, which we did. So that's one of the things that we have a large issue. The other issue in this area is that we have a very low access to the berm. So at high tide, that high tide is all the way up to that dune scarp. And unfortunately, my bobcat can't swim. We're working on that. We're trying to figure out floaties, but we haven't figured that out yet. And the material tends to move during these high tide events, especially when we have an extremely strong tide. So that reintroduces it back into the system, which then again leads to the future problems. So far, we've removed 256,000 pounds this entire year just from this project. So it's been really great. The one thing that we have had a challenge with is how do you hold somebody accountable when it's 11 years later? At what point do you hold them accountable? Can you add it into your contract? Those are all things that we are exploring right now. And these are some of our lovely volunteers and some of my lovely staff on that last picture being proactive in removing all of the material out of the area, and they've all been great. But we've had good support with our local community members. We've been able to open up lines of communication prior to storm events between different agencies so that we know who's responding to what, so that there's no duplicated effort across the board.
Thank you, Kathleen. And our final speaker for this section is Bill Burkett.
Okay. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to come up from Virginia to give you an idea of some of the things that we do to help support. I guess that font's a little difficult. Can you read it? Okay. All right, just looks funky from here. All right. Where I get involved with debris field is typically if one of these three incidents that happens, all right? Severe weather, which a lot of folks have already talked about that. Instead of having maritime accidents, I should have phrased it as maritime events or incidents, okay, because they're all not accidents, all right? Then the abandoned derelict vessel thing, I know there's going to be a lot of discussion about that. We could spend the entire day just talking about that piece alone. So I'll just kind of glaze over that quickly when I get to it. But typically what I do, let me go back and jump ahead. There we go. The Port of Virginia. Our port is not unlike Port of Baltimore, Port Del Bay, and those others, okay? The Virginia Port Authority, who I work for, if you look at that picture, we're only responsible for 5 terminals amongst all those terminals that you see. And in addition to that, we have the world's largest naval base that sits right there at the entrance to the harbor. So debris means a lot to us, okay? Because not only is it a nuisance when it hits the beach, it could be a hazmat, it's just nasty stuff. But if the debris, whatever you define debris as, starts to impact critical infrastructure, such as our shipping channels and our lanes and other things like that, not only do we have an impact to commerce, but in particular to the Port of Virginia, we now have a national security issue when big Navy cannot deploy or come back, okay? And a lot of our debris, the cases I've been involved with, has certainly closed the channels for a short period of time where we have to get out there and do what we have to do as quickly as possible. So with the MERT team, what I'm responsible for, a lot of my duties, responsibilities inside of our gates, emergency management, emergency operations. But outside of our gates, I help work with the Coast Guard. Basically, I am working for the sector commander for Sector Virginia, the captain of the port, where I bring all the response agencies together, both law enforcement, fire, and those other folks, with their vessels and their personnel to help respond from an all hazards perspective to support the Coast Guard. All right, so we're called on all hazards, any type of events. One of those things that we do, of course, is support the Coast Guard when they have to close the port due to a severe storm. That could be a northeaster, any type of tropical storm winds are going to hit the terminals or hit the mouth of the bay. The Coast Guard will close that, all right? And what that also does, that impacts Baltimore because the vessel traffic can't transit up and down. But in order for the captain of the port to reopen that port, the channels have to be assessed and some other things, but we'll get to that more in a second. Also, hazards of navigation includes, we've had, unfortunately, you can set your watch to it or your calendar, about every 18 months or so, we get a tractor trailer that goes off the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, all right? And when that happens, we are responding to not only to do a search and rescue, but most of the time it's recovery of the victims. And then we also have to deal with the containers or the vehicles themselves. And we've also had plane crashes, helicopter crashes that will impact channels we have to work to. Now, I will tell you, we talked about it briefly, the funding piece, when you're trying to do debris recovery, becomes very important. Also, it becomes very clunky in a response capability. For instance, if the severe weather, if the storm has a name, and then there's been a declaration of emergency, whatever you want to call it, at the federal, state, or local levels, those are much easier to deal with because your debris management plans come into play, right? You can get that funding, that recovery piece reimbursed. It's these one-offs that happen where those systems are not been declared or they're not in place that really becomes an issue to call out your resources to either put a line on it or to get a crane barge out there to do whatever you need to do to recover it. Because the question is, number one, who's responsible? Number two, who's going to pay for it? All right? I get a lot of calls, especially vessels where the derelict vessel comes in for me are the vessels that are adrift, not up on the beach, but they're adrift that could impact channels. And to ask a police department or a fire department or another OGA, other governmental agencies, to come out and put a line on it and tow it becomes very problematic. Number one is once they put the line on the boat, they now own it. And secondly, where are you going to take it? Most marinas won't even accept them. So it's a big thing that I know that it's just it's a problem that almost everybody's dealing with on a regular basis. So, but we've become creative over the time to make that happen. Okay, let's see. All right, the coastal storm debris, once the captain of the port, we closed the port, the storm has passed, now we need to do an assessment. By the way, that nautical chart, typically they don't look like that. Those colored zones where, if you're familiar with the incident command system, that's the way that we delegate our 204s that we send out to the boat crews. They'll get underway in their boats and they'll check those parts of the channels that's between sets of buoys, and they'll look for large debris fields. They're making sure the buoys are in place, and also they're running sonar to determine if they got any debris has shifted underneath the channel. Then that way either it has to be recovered or we get NOAA or Army Corps to go in there to do more of a hydrographic survey of that area. And as you can see in the other picture, that's just some of the debris that we typically come across that the guys will grab and just put into the boats and move on. But fortunately to this date, every time that we've had to reopen the port, we have not had significant debris fields or anything like that. So this process that you see here, we can typically get our channels surveyed from Richmond, Virginia, all the way down to the Virginia-Carolina line, both in the coastal waterway inshore and the ones up the bay that you see here at off Cape Henry. We've done it in less than 2 hours with over 26 vessels underway at the same time. And we help the Coast Guard manage that piece. And then if we do find the debris, we just have to work through it based on local knowledge, where to take it to, and just work through the process there. We've had buoys that have sunk or broke loose and come adrift. This particular buoy was hooked by the Staten Island Ferry. That was a dead ship tow. They're taking it from a shipyard, towing it back to New York to put it back in service. A freak, well, thunderstorm, let's put it that way, came up. It grabbed it set the ferry on top of the buoy and it drug it for a certain period of time, and it ended up putting it on the bottom. We had to close the channel because we did not know where the buoy was. So after a few hours, and also with sonar ops that you see there, we're able to locate the buoy in this section of the anchorage. Was determined that the buoy was not in the channel, so he could reopen the channel, which we did do, but it took us about 2 weeks just to recover the buoy. All right, so just another example of which we may not consider debris, a navigation buoy, but in this case it does become that, and we have to address it. So, and during that storm, we actually did the sonar and storm force winds on a Navy salvage tug all throughout the night to determine that that channel was open. And that was partners from Norfolk Police with their sonar unit and one of the Navy mobile dive units with their sonar just to check that. So it was a pretty interesting event. Here's a picture, again, like I just mentioned, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. That's one of our last vehicles that we had that went off. It took us about 2 days to recover that. And but what's nice about the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, if you can call it nice for lack of better terms, is they have a contract with Crofton Diving, the salvage company out of Portsmouth, Virginia. They have a very significant lot of resources. So anything that happens around the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, they don't care who it is. That Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel Authority will take actions to get that recovered as quickly as possible. So we really don't have to deal with who's the owner, who's responsible. They'll just handle it. So that really makes it nice. And that was recovery there. Also, you know, being several large container terminals that we own and operate, every now and then the boxes will be knocked off the ships during container ops. In this case, it was a day after the recovery of that tractor trailer. I got a phone call. We had 8 boxes knocked off the ship, and they were all adrift in the Elizabeth River. So fortunately, with our partnerships with our local responders, we got the boats out there. As you see, those are 2 police boats, one from Norfolk, one from Hampton. They were able to grab the floating boxes, push them to the piers or where cranes can get them. Of the 8, 4 sunk, and they were able to immediately mark those with buoys and sonars to determine where they were. So they were recovered like 6 hours later, which reopened the southern branch of the Elizabeth River. Because that's a 45-foot deep channel, but one of the 40-foot containers literally set up on its end, so it turned that 45-foot channel into a 7-foot channel. Okay, so we had to close it until those could be recovered. But just to give you some idea of other events, and again, this had nothing to do with severe weather or anything like that, but these are just some of the things that we have to deal with on a regular basis, because it is impacting that critical infrastructure. She mentioned a storm in April of this past year. The city of Virginia Beach experienced a significant tornado that came across. It was during the event put on by Pharrell, something in the water that was happening at the oceanfront. And this came in right on top of it. And you can see the storm clouds building. There's a picture of the tornadoes that's getting ready to cross over into Broad Bay Estates and come over Broad Bay. It just shows you the tracks, a little bit of information on it. And it went through a pretty significant upscale neighborhood, and it just tore it to pieces like it was Legos, I'll be honest with you. But if you look at the picture in the middle, that was all the debris that we found in the waterways. I got the call that evening to come and assist both Virginia Beach Fire and Police and the Coast Guard with doing a marine debris assessment. So we got boats underway to do that. We found initially that's this type of debris that you see there. Some of it was floating. We could grab it and tow it to the boat ramp. Other was actually embedded into the bottom that required their City of Virginia Beach dredge operations to come out with their vessel and literally pull it out of the bottom to get it there. But due to the fact on this particular event that emergency was declared, so the ability to gather that stuff was funded, well funded. It was not any discussion who owned it, who was responsible for it. It was all gathered up, put at that one point, and then it was hauled to the dump from there. So that's what we do, and I'll be available for questions afterwards.
First off, thank you for everything you guys do and making sure our shorelines keep running. But all of you mentioned the discussions that you have to have around property ownership and who's funding it. How long do those conversations typically last, and how long is that delay before you can really take action on something?
For things that, for our response, it usually is not things that are critical that we have to get permission to go on property. It just have to be cautious. It's like something we're worried about. Let's say it's going to come off on a high tide. So it's more caution, I would say, for me, just to make sure. And it's especially because we have, like, let's say big homeowners associations where you don't realize that you're not speaking to the right person. You think this person's very authoritative, and then it's like, no, they're not. They're not really in charge. And you find out that, if you want to bring your piece of equipment across someone's fragile piece of asphalt, and if you break it up, it could be a problem. So just those kind of things. And but other than that, jurisdiction-wise kinds of things, I think, as Bill said, we work really well. Same with the Port of Baltimore and Corps, and any of the other. I try not to punish anybody that does the right thing. Like for example, I've had people have a big timber floating by their dock. They've jumped out, swam over to it, drug it over, and tied it off to their dock. I'll get it. They'll call. I'll come up and get it, because I won't punish somebody for doing the right thing.
Yeah, in my world, especially, let's suppose it's just an abandoned vessel that's adrift. First thing we ask when we're talking to the sector, the command center, and the Coast Guard, do we have an owner? And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, okay? And unfortunately, some of those owners do not have the means to pay for that salvage or that recovery. So a lot of times the discussion would be, all right, let's at least do something. In many cases, and again, I probably opened myself up to criticism here, but we've actually placed anchor kits on most of our emergency response vessels. And those anchor kits consist of an anchor, a small anchor, set of chain, a line with a buoy, right? And what we'll do is we'll get that boat out of a shipping channel, get it to kind of a sheltered waters, for lack of better terms, and we'll anchor it. So at least we know where it is. And we'll give the lat lawns and those type of things. So you reduce the risk to the boating community, and also you hope that you're eliminating the hazard to the environment at the same time. But and sometimes in the big commercial world, you got to dig down a little bit to figure out really who is the owner or the operator. But in many cases, if we see a severe threat, we'll respond and start to mitigate it, but knowing that at some point this issue is going to have to be addressed. And I'll be honest with you, in some of our areas, like Crofton Diving, for instance, we actually had a boat that washed up on the sailboat due to severe weather. Unfortunately, the owner drowned inside of the boat, so we knew we had a body in the boat, but there was really no way to recover it. And they didn't know if he had insurance. So luckily, the salver stopped up and said, look, I'll get him out. So they did it on his own, and then we just worked it out down the road. So it's kind of gray, and I think you'll see there's a lot of gray in this area, so that's why it's just hit and miss at who you're dealing with at the time.
So in terms for the state of Delaware, we have what's called the abandoned boat rule. So for abandoned derelict vessels, if it is an immediate hazard to navigations, my program has the immediate right to go and take it and remove it out of the system, regardless of who the ownership is. So we see this a lot with coastal storm response, like Hurricane Ophelia. We had 3 vessels that had lost their mooring. One ended up on a beach and basically beached itself. Another ended up sinking right outside of a state-maintained beach. We're still working on removing that one. And then another one happened to be floating free on our inland bays. The owner happened to be able to recover it. When a vessel sinks within Delaware state waters, we have what's known as the shipwreck rule. This is part of our state constitution. I have the immediate right to go and mitigate it. The problem becomes funding. We have an extreme lack of vendors who have the knowledge, skills, and capabilities of being able to assist us, and I am right now currently about 30% capacity as in terms of my manpower. So the crew that I would have normally have sent out to go and recover some of these things, they're just not available at this point in time because we have other responsibilities within the state that kind of take precedence because those are health and human, related projects.
Thanks you all for a really great and comprehensive conversation. I was just wondering, so are there any gaps in services or technology products that you guys can think of that would make your lives easier?
Can you create more people that want to work for me? That would be great. I know that, at least for me, one of the gaps that I've got is I have a much older crew. So technologically friendly equipment has been difficult to obtain just due to the cost. So I own and operate anywhere between $15 to $20 million worth of vessels, heavy equipment operations, and other types of equipment. Many of them are equipped with, sonar and different technologies, but right now the ability for them to relate that information into our state system is a little bit lacking.
From a technology perspective, as you mentioned, there's a lot out there. The issue is knowing what's out there and who has it. Okay? For instance, and again, just from a dive ops, public safety diver perspective, there's a lot with sonar, there's a lot with ROVs, right? And so to be able to put something down, to look at something, to determine what that target is, what that sonar saw, either it's a diver or it's an ROV. And I think the ROV, with the technology that they have now, in my opinion, enhances that safety, plus with the cameras and the visual you can put on it. But what we're finding, many ROVs aren't strong enough to operate in our currents. You got to find it at slack water. And also when you fund these things and you go at them from a grant perspective, if you've got 16 dive teams like we do in our area, why do you need 16 of it? So you got to, really be at a regional level, be geographic. All right, let's put 2 on the peninsula, let's put 2 on the south side, and share these resources. So identify them and what you have in your area, and then call them for them and let them work. That's where I see the gap. We're not calling for a lot of stuff that's already available.
I think there's a very lacking area of what to do with abandoned boats. The first gen, I know it's not, it's no great revelation, but the first generation fiberglass boats, the boats that the cabin cruisers that one engine's bad and you have to rip the entire sealant out of it to put in, it's worthless at that point. And then large sailboats, and just what we have to do is we have an excavator with a thumb. We scrap what we can scrap, and we have to take it in pieces, throw it in a dumpster, and to the dump it goes. And that's the technology that exists, and that's the least worst case scenario. But that's where I'd love to see someone come up with something that was to do with fiberglass boats.
And many landfills won't take them after a certain size. So that's the other issue, is what to do with them if they're too large.